Well, first of all, a great welcome to everybody here this evening for the inaugural Seamus Deane Field Day lecture series, which will be given by Seamus himself in a few moments. My name is Joe Cleary, and I'm going to give a short introduction, a sort of profile or outline of Seamus's career before we begin, just as a way to begin this lecture series, which we hope will be an annual one for many years to come. But it's great that so many people have turned out, and I think we're about ready now to get things underway. It's a great honour for me to be asked to introduce Seamus Deane at this inaugural lecture series. I am very conscious of the fact that many people here will know Seamus much better than I do, and will know him in several capacities that I can't hope really here this evening to address. Many people here, I am assuming, will know Seamus from his years in Derry and Belfast. Some of you perhaps will know him best as the author of many volumes of poetry and of the novel Reading in the Dark, one of the handful of really accomplished novels to come out of the Troubles. Others of you will know him as a colleague, fellow director of the Field Day Theatre Company. And I should at this stage pay brief tribute to Stephen Ray, because I know that Stephen has been perhaps the prime mover of this Seamus Deane lecture series. Stephen, I should say, has been a great friend and in many ways a great devotee of Seamus and of Seamus's work over very many years now, over several decades in fact. And it is to his efforts, I think, that we owe this occasion. Others of you, again, will know Seamus as a teacher, lecturer, editor, family man, and so on. However, the Seamus Deane that I want to speak a little bit about this evening, since it's the Seamus Deane that I know best myself, is Seamus Deane the critic. Seamus is a man of many parts, but I think it is through his criticism in particular that he has expressed what he has to say about Ireland and about the world, and where perhaps he has said it in most memorably burnished form. Seamus Deane's major critical writings have appeared in 5 volumes, which have been published over a span of exactly 20 years. Celtic Revivals, Essays in Modern Irish Literature, 1880 to 1980, appeared in 1985. A Short History of Irish Literature and the French Revolution and Enlightenment in England both appeared 3 years later in 1988. Strange Country, Literature and Nationhood in Irish Writing since 1790 in 1997, and Foreign Affections, Essays on Edmund Burke in 2005. The first 3 of these critical volumes that I've just mentioned, Celtic Revivals, The Short History, and the French Revolution and Enlightenment book, appeared, as I said, within 3 years of each other. They are very clearly the harvest of a much longer period of reading, and they're indicative both of, I suppose, the completion, the fruition of a very spectacular critical apprenticeship, and they announced in no uncertain terms the appearance of a new and, as I hope to show in many ways, unprecedented new voice in Irish letters. The period immediately after these 3 volumes was devoted almost entirely to the great collaborative project that was the Field Day Anthology of Irish Writing, the first 3 volumes of which appeared in 1991 and would be followed later by 2 others. And then this massive and I'm sure in many ways exhausting collaborative project was followed again quickly by 2 further works, the novel Reading in the Dark and the masterful and still underappreciated, I think, Strange Country, which appeared, as I said, in 1997. And since in the period leading up to and following from the publication of Foreign Affections, Essays on Edmund Burke, Seamus has also authored a great many essays on Irish writing, but also on English and European writing more generally. Many of these volumes, which have appeared in Irish, English, American, and other publications, other journals, have never been collected. And if there's any enterprising young scholar out there, I think Oscar Ray perhaps is in the audience, if these essays, many of them I know brilliant works in themselves, if these essays were to be collected, they would probably add another 2 or 3 volumes to the 5 that I've already mentioned. Now, what can one say in a very brief period about the career, the intellectual vision, the achievement that is compressed into these 5 books? Well, now that the 20th century has closed, now that the book has closed on that in some ways awful century, I think we can say, and say without fear of quarrel, that Seamus Deane is by some distance the finest and the most influential critic to come out of Ireland in that last century. To take the true measure of that achievement is no easy matter, since the function or the purpose of literary criticism is often difficult to understand. Many critics themselves, I think, have difficulty understanding it, and as does the general public. So let me very briefly try to outline my own sense of the conditions out of which Seamus shaped his intellectual career, and also to give very briefly again, and obviously crudely in that way, some sense of what he brought to pass by way of his labours. As everybody knows, because we boast a great deal about this, Ireland produced a spectacular catalogue of writers in the 20th century. Most of them were born in the 19th, but the list is extraordinary and impressive. Wilde, Shaw, Yeats, Joyce, O'Casey, Beckett, Bowen, on up to Heaney, Friel, Mahon, McGahern, you know the list. You might well say that in a small, divided society such as ours, there was an opulence of talent here, an embarrassment of riches that might perhaps overwhelm almost any critical establishment. Is there any small country such as ours, economically sometimes disastrous, politically partitioned, religiously divided, and with historically a very underdeveloped university system, which might have been able to produce a body of critics equal to so spectacular and in some ways so bizarre a literature? And if one was to go back to the early part of the 20th century, I think matters were even more complex in some ways, because certainly at the time of the revival and at the time of the Easter Rising, the very idea of a modern Irish literature or a modern Irish criticism which would address itself to that modern literature scarcely existed. At the start of the 20th century, there were literary critics in Ireland, but almost nothing that we might call an Irish literary criticism that would address itself to what we might call Irish writing or Irish literature. Instead, there were at that time, I think, 2 critical traditions, both largely Protestant because such was the nature of the professions and the intelligentsia at the time. And we might very broadly categorize these 2 traditions as the first, perhaps, you might call it either ethnographic or anthropological or antiquarian, and the other what I would call, let's say, cosmopolitan or assimilated. For the ethnographic tradition, and here we might trace the line from people like Charlotte O'Brooke to Thomas Crofton Croker, up to all the way through the 19th century to Standish O'Grady and the early William Butler Yeats. For these, Ireland was essentially a very ancient land, a very ancient country, and its literature was essentially a classical literature of epic and saga, or at a more popular level, a literature of the folk, a literature of folk tales and fairy. For this tradition, modern Irish literature, modern Irish writing, held very little interest. It was the antiquarian literature of Ireland that mattered. The other mode of criticism, and here we might count figures such as Edward Dowden, Oscar Wilde, and later George Bernard Shaw, was a very cosmopolitan criticism in the sense that it tried to address itself essentially to an English audience. Many of these critics might have been conscious of their Irishness. Some of them indeed were quite engaged in Irish politics and cultural matters, but they essentially wrote as English critics, writing for an English audience. And for these two, the idea of a modern Irish literature scarcely existed, or if it did exist, it might have been considered a dangerous absurdity, since some of them were strongly unionist in their convictions. So coming into the 20th century then, Irish critics confronted, I think, a very particular situation. A rich and bizarre literature was emerging through revival and high modernism. But the country had very weak academic institutions, and as I've just said, scarcely anything by way of an Irish criticism addressing itself to a modern Irish literature. In the circumstances, I think it would fall largely to critics, mostly of Catholic background, many of them Republicans or ex-Republicans, to forge the kind of Irish criticism that had never existed before. Of these, people like Thomas MacDonagh, more importantly Daniel O'Corkery, Sean O'Faolain, Denis Donoghue are the most salient figures. And then in some ways bringing that line, that particular line that I've just mentioned, to completion, Seamus Deane. Daniel Corkery, the most formative and audacious figure in the early part of that line, notoriously dismissed the whole of Anglo-Irish literature before the revival, and indeed much of the revivalist literature itself, as a colonial literature. There were some good reasons for this assessment, but of course by dismissing such a huge swath of Irish writing, Corkery also greatly simplified his own task, or the task of the critic, since if this could be set aside as a colonial literature, it didn't, in Corkery's view, seriously need to be engaged. Sean O'Faolain, a sometimes student of Corkery, but taking issue with him, felt that much of the Yeatsian revival was too aristocratic to serve a small, fledgling peasant democracy like Ireland. And much of Joycean high modernism, and of course Corkery is writing in the period when Joyce is immersed in what would become Finnegan's Wake, much of high modernism, in O'Faolain's opinion, was simply too obscure, too esoteric to be of service to a new nation like Ireland either. And again, we might quarrel with O'Faolain's views, but there were certain kinds of reasons or rationale behind it. But again, of course, by sidelining what was to be such a formative literature for the 20th century as Joyce's and the high modernists generally, Beckett's too, O'Faolain undoubtedly greatly oversimplified the task of the critic. Denis Donoghue, a fellow Northerner and sometimes a colleague of Seamus's at UCD, for a time at least, took a line directly contrary to both Corkery and O'Faolain by making modernist literature, 20th century modernism, or Irish modernism, the absolute focus of his interests, particularly Yeats and Joyce, to a lesser extent Beckett. Though Donoghue, of course, would have quarrelled with the idea of an Irish modernism. For him, as for so many critics in the 60s and the 70s, modernism was essentially an international, a European, a non-national affair. Now, Seamus Deane, in my view, absorbed something important from all of these predecessors. But what makes his work stand out from theirs, and not only stand out from theirs, but ultimately to surpass theirs in its importance for the future, is his capacity to critically engage with the whole of modern literature from the 18th century to the 20th, to the late 20th at that. No other critic has possessed the range of reading to do this. None other either has been able to do so with such penetrating intellect, and also, it has to be said, with such terrific style. To all of these different branches of literature that others were to put aside or to pass over for various reasons, good and bad, Seamus was to bring a kind of passionate commitment, but also a terrific coolness of intellectual judgment. His training in his early doctoral work in Cambridge, in the literatures of the French Enlightenment, and in the English reception, mostly hostile of that Enlightenment, was probably decisive here, because I think it gave Seamus a grounding in the 18th century, a grounding in European intellectual traditions and literatures, and a long historical view that very few could match. We can see this ambition to grasp the totality of Irish writing, to grasp its connections, to grasp its fixations, even in its transformations, as early on as the short history. And of course, this urge, again, to try to understand not just this or that author or this or that period singularly, but to try to grasp the relations within the whole. We can see this coming to full ambition in the field day ontology of Irish writing, and again, in Strange Country. And we should ask, what is wrested? What is plucked from these surveys? What is plucked, I think, is not just an assemblage of writers and books, a catalogue of this or that writer, or a tradition that we're invited to admire, not just a portrait of this or that or the other artist, but rather a profound grasp of the intellectual ambitions, the intellectual differences and hatreds generated by different ambitions, the imaginative strivings and visions of a people. You don't quite read a Seamus Deane critical work to be told what a wonderful writer Swift was, or Joyce was, or Beckett, or Heaney, or whomever. You will, along the way, indeed learn what is significant about these writers, why they are the substantive figures that they are. But you read a Seamus Deane work is to read a Seamus Deane work is to try to understand the intellectual and imaginative struggles of a people. The struggles of a people to absorb the traumas of its history, to make sense of its experience, to shape a future that it might more comfortably inhabit. Very few societies, and I was really trying to cast my mind around this morning to think of comparable examples, but very few societies are lucky enough to produce in a single critic so wide a reach and so incisive a judgment as Seamus has possessed. In the neighbouring island, I can really only think of one figure, Raymond Williams, a Welshman, who could reign so ably across so many centuries and take the pulse, so to speak, of both its literary and intellectual life in the way that Seamus has done for Irish writing and Irish literature. And I don't think it dishonours Williams in any way. Williams is an extraordinary critic to say that in some ways Seamus is a much more fastidious and finer stylist. I want to just close now with reading one short paragraph, the concluding paragraph of the short history of Irish literature. This paragraph, I should say before I start to read it, was written in 1985, perhaps it was published in 1986, so I'm assuming it was written a little bit before that. And so 20 many odd years ago, as I read this, you might think about how it resonated when it would have appeared to a reader, let's say reading it in 1986 when it was fresh from the press, and think about how this paragraph reads now. This is the epilogue to A Short History of Irish Literature. One of the recurrent paradoxes of Irish writing is its continuous preoccupation with the experience of discontinuity. This in itself would not be enough to allow us to speak of the existence of a tradition, however elusive that term tradition may be when it comes under investigation. But in addition, the discontinuity has been the product of unique historical circumstances, not matched in Western Europe. For 3, perhaps 4 centuries, Irish literature has lived in the shadow of political and economic breakdowns of distressing frequency. It has lived between 2 languages and 2 cultures. It has competed with antiquarian and historical research, with political theory and clerical... I've lost my space. It has competed with political theory and clerical polemics. And it is in this attempt to identify the existence of a cultural community in which the possibility of freedom might be won. In the 20th century in particular, these experiences and the habituation of the Irish mind and sensibility to them have given the literature of the country a prominence never known before. It is, in many ways, a specifically modern literature bred out of the most dishevelled and improbable circumstances. By now, it is neither Gaelic nor Anglo-Irish writing which is central, The conciliation between the two, although by no means complete, is sufficiently advanced to allow us to use of the phrase Irish writing without fear of it being misunderstood or recruited to any particular group or sect. That at least is one symptom of a fundamental and hopeful change. Let me pluck 3 phrases from that passage. Political and economic breakdowns of distressing frequency. Well, we still seem to live with those. Irish writing. To identify the existence of a cultural community in which the possibility of freedom might be won. As I've said, the political and economic breakdowns of distressing frequency we still live with. But what Seamus has asked us to do, not just in this work, but in all of his work, is to conjugate those things, Irish writing, political and economic breakdown, but also to keep alive the struggle for, the determination intellectually and imaginatively to bring about the existence of a cultural community in which the possibility of freedom might be won. I'm going to hand you over now to Seamus.